WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So last night came the first real test of whether Mayor Mamdani can actually freeze the rent. The Rent Guidelines Board, the body that sets rents for roughly 1 million stabilized apartments, held its preliminary vote, and a 2-year freeze is genuinely on the table. The board voted to consider a range of 0 to 2% on 1-year leases and 0 to 4% on 2-year leases. So we'll talk about that now with our housing reporter, David Brand, who was at the meeting last night. He's also been on some of the other big housing stories in the city right now, including the fatal fire in Inwood, with a deeply troubling backstory. That was very near where I live, and I walked over there and saw the building and its aftermath, and honestly, there was still a big crowd outside on the afternoon after, and I could see the grief on people's faces. David, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Brian.
And listeners, are you a rent-stabilized tenant, a landlord? Anything you want to ask or say to our housing reporter, David Brand, about the vote yesterday, or the fatal apartment fire in Inwood, or any other housing news? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. All right, what is 0 to 2% for 1-year leases, 0 to 4% for 2-year leases actually mean? They didn't simply vote to freeze the rent.
Right. So the process is a little complicated, so we should explain how this works. So for the past few months, the city's Rent Guidelines Board, these 9 members appointed by the mayor, 2 represent tenants, 2 represent landlords, and 5 ostensibly represent the interests of the city as a whole. They're called the public members. They consider data on landlord expenses, on tenant expenses, on building incomes, how much rent they generate, and then they use that data to come up with this range at this preliminary vote that they held yesterday for how much they might, at the future final vote to increase or potentially freeze the rent. And so that's what they voted on yesterday, the range that they're going to consider. And like you said, they're considering 0%, which is a freeze, up to 2% increase on 1-year leases, and again, a 0%, a freeze, up to 4% on 2-year leases. And it's the first time they've considered, in that preliminary vote, a freeze on 2-year leases.
And they take a final vote next month, right? This comes in June, so this is the preliminary, then there's one more round of public comment, and then they take their final vote?
That's right. So there's going to be a series of hearings for members of the public, tenants, landlords, or just, people who don't have a dog in the fight but want to express themselves can also testify at these public meetings in all 5 boroughs. And then the final vote will be June 25th. Interesting note on that is that last week, Mayor Mamdani announced his new Office of Mass Engagement has a program called Organize NYC, where they're going to be knocking doors and encouraging people to come out to testify at these Rent Guidelines Board meetings. So, they're probably going to knock on a lot of tenants' doors. It's a city of renters, and in an apartment building, the people living there are tenants, but they say it's also going to try to attract and draw landlords to come testify as well.
Can they do that? Is that taxpayer-funded activism on one side of an issue?
Well, that's the question. I mean, it's a taxpayer-funded effort for sure. Landlord groups, Landlord Lobbying Group, New York Apartment Association, which represents owners of buildings with rent-stabilized apartments, says this is just kind of a way to mask their true effort, which is to get tenants to come out and demand a rent freeze. Mamdani says, no, this is about civic engagement. This is kind of the first installment of what this office is going to be doing to generate more civic engagement, and that they're not going to be taking a position on telling people. He said 0 tolerance, I think, for encouraging people to testify one way or the other. So we'll see.
We should say that tenant members pushed for a negative range. They pushed for an actual rent cut. I don't know that the Rent Guidelines Board has ever done that. And landlord members pushed for increases of 3% to 5.5% or more. So, of course, those are the arguing positions, and then we see what the board actually does. I'm interested by the wording in the mayor's press release after this, David. You know, I'm on their mailing list, so I got this in my inbox last night. And among the words attributed to the mayor here were, I'm encouraged to see the board taking seriously the data around affordability, operating expenses, and the pressures facing both tenants and small property owners as it sets this preliminary range. So a couple of things about that. He singled out the pressures facing both tenants and small property owners. Does the Rent Guidelines Board have the ability to distinguish between big corporate landlords who might own hundreds or even thousands of rent-stabilized apartments and aren't affected in the same way by a zero or a small rent increase as small property owners are?
That's a great question. And I could say that in two occasions, both under Mayor Bloomberg, the Rent Guidelines Board he appointed, did what they call the proviso, where they voted for a certain increase on tenants who had a lease of 6 or more years and a different increase for tenants who had a lease of 6 or fewer years. And so now landlord groups are saying the Rent Guidelines Board has the authority to make these kinds of split increases. And they are not focusing on the size of the landlord's portfolio. That is an interesting question, and I think possibly something that could be considered. But the way that these portfolios are broken down into like single entity LLCs, which every building, maybe they share technically a common owner, but technically they're broken down into individual LLCs. That might be hard to distinguish. But they are calling for a split increase based on the age of the building, because there's basically two types of rent-stabilized apartment buildings. There are buildings that were built before 1974 with 6 or more units. That's kind of the more traditional type. And then there's newer buildings, including some very fancy luxury waterfront buildings that were constructed with city or state financing or with tax breaks. And so in exchange for those benefits, the landlords agree to rent regulations, even if the rent might be very high. So they want the landlords want a higher increase for the older buildings and maybe a moderate increase for the newer ones.
And another part of that quote that I read from the mayor's press release, where he referred to taking seriously the data around affordability and operating expenses. I think on the operating expenses data, we have a landlord calling in, I think, Chris in Woodside, you're on WNYC. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Brian. Thank you very much for taking my call. Actually, it's funny that you singled that out, because that is actually what I want to push back on. Just look at the report from this year from the Rent Guidelines Board. They put out one every year that it's called the Price Index of Operating Costs, and it details how much, on average, building costs have gone up. This year, it went up, according to their research, 5.3%. So already, even with the proposed guidelines, we're not going to be able to even meet that. And since 2000, they've only met the actual rent increase has only been equal or greater than the rent costs twice. And it's now been 10 years in a row since the costs have gone up more than the actual rents. It's not sustainable. And I'd like to liken it to your situation, in which you had a kind of a political government come in that kind of is attacking you guys, took away your funding. But imagine if they took away your funding and then capped you guys with the amount of donors you were allowed, and then every year, as a cruel joke, would do a report saying how much the costs have increased on a radio station, and then made sure that the allowable amount that you could get from donors was less than that. It would be, again, I'm pretty sure you guys would be out of business within a certain amount of time. And still, one more fact, in the end, it's the state that actually is hurt the most for the building owners, and that's because the vacant apartments are still being capped, and that's from the 2019 rent laws, and that's a state thing.
the public radio analogy to the freeze to rent debate. Very creative, Chris. I don't think anybody's come up with that one before. But to his points, David, if he's right, if you look at the inflation rates, let's say since the pandemic, under Biden for various reasons, now under Trump for various reasons, and compare them to the increases that the Rent Guidelines Board has allowed, maybe inflation has galloped faster than what the landlords have been able to recoup. Did the Rent Guidelines Board come out with any finding one way or the other on that?
Well, they didn't really discuss that specifically yesterday. They did do a hearing on that, the PIOC that he mentioned, the price index of operating costs. I'm not sure if I got the acronym correct right there, but no, he's right that expenses have increased for owners. I think tenant groups would point out that also across the board, incomes from rent and other revenue also increased for the third straight year for landlords. Got to break that down, though. There's nuance in all of this. We mentioned there's different types of buildings. There's buildings that are 100% rent stabilized. There's buildings where maybe just one unit is rent stabilized and owners can do whatever they want with the market rate units they own in terms of how much they're charging. And so it's hard to paint all of this, a million different apartments and buildings across the city with one broad brush. And so I mentioned that 6% income increase. That was really driven by a much larger increase in what they call core Manhattan, which is Manhattan below West 110th Street, East 96th Street. You saw smaller increases in other boroughs and then actually an income decrease in the Bronx. And there's a pretty high concentration of buildings that are actually in financial distress in the Bronx, meaning their expenses are outpacing their incomes. So that's all to say that it's hard to paint the entire housing stock with one broad brush and is one of the big challenges for the Rent Guidelines Board.
We heard from a landlord, and Chris, thank you very much. Keep calling us. Now we're going to hear from, I presume, a rent-stabilized tenant who's picking up on what the tenant advocates were actually asking for that I cited before. Not only a freeze, but a rent rollback. Adam in Inwood, you're on WNYC. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Brian. Hey, David.
Hey.
So my name is Adam, and I'm an organizer with the Upper Manhattan Tenants Union. And yeah, as you all mentioned, I just wanted to uplift that the Rent Justice Coalition, which is a collection of tenant organizations that's been organizing around the Rent Guidelines Board process for many years now, has been and is demanding a rent rollback. That was, of course, proposed at last night's meeting, but was voted down. But I think until a final determination is made, I think people ought to continue to push for a rent rollback because, one, that's what's needed. Rents are already too damn high. A freeze is just going to keep them that way. Owners have been making huge profits for many years.
You say that, but what do you say to the previous caller who was arguing that inflation has gone up more than Rent Guidelines Board rents?
So maybe that's true for the past few years, but owners made huge profits in the 2010s and going back to the 90s when vacancy deregulation became more permissible. And so I think oftentimes like those arguments that point to rising costs of maintenance and inflation and utilities and whatnot, they're just kind of like narrowly focused on like the past 3 or 5 years, whereas we ought to be looking at the bigger picture, like going back further, the profits that owners have made and really continue to make.
Adam, thank you very much for your call. Before we run out of time, David, I do want to touch on the Inwood fire the other day, which killed 3 people and displaced more than 100 residents. You reported that the very same landlord had been sued by the city just 1 week earlier, and that lawsuit specifically cited fire hazards at the building next door. The New York Times says city records show the building that burned had so many housing code violations that it was put into a special program to correct safety issues known as the Alternative Enforcement Program. A report sent by the Department of Housing Preservation and Development to the City Council in March said the building had almost 150 hazardous violations. That from the New York Times. But obviously there it was still, right? And vulnerable as it was, and we see what happened. So my question to you is, what questions does this raise about how the city's enforcement system is or isn't working?
Yeah, I think it in some ways points to the limits of enforcement. I mean, so we first reported this last week. Earlier this week, I got the tip that look at this landlord, the lawsuits against them, and that city housing agency had sued for a number of problems, including fire hazards at the building right next door. And this is essentially one complex. You know, they're connected. There's a small courtyard that separates them in the middle, and then they're connected again in the back. And a lot of similar problems at the building that burned and that 3 people died at. And so I think in some ways shows the limits of the enforcement, and that we don't know the cause of the fire just yet, but potentially some of this was preventable and foreseen.
What happens to those 100 now homeless or at least displaced residents? Any idea?
Well, we see this over and over again after a disaster, especially fires. People end up displaced for months, potentially even years. So they will start at Red Cross shelters. There's a time limit on those. City's housing agency will then put them up into other emergency shelters, usually at hotels. They might have the opportunity to get a housing voucher and try to find an apartment somewhere else, or they might have to just wait it out to get back to their old apartment. And then the problem there is how long it takes the property owner to complete the renovations, get the building up to code so that people can return. And we see time and again that can take a really long time. And there's some laws or some legislation now being negotiated in the state about trying to speed up moving people back into their homes after disaster. But that's a problem. We see it over and over again after these fires, floods, and other disasters.
Hey, David, before you go, and on a much lighter note, I really enjoyed your piece yesterday on Kearney, New Jersey, the cradle of American soccer, as you called it, ahead of the World Cup. You're a housing reporter. How did that story find you? And what does Kearney tell us about the relationship between maybe immigrant communities, sports, and place?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, that changing topics a little bit, but the World Cup's coming up. I'm obsessed with soccer. My mom grew up in North Arlington, which is a town next to Kearney, so I always grew up visiting my grandparents, driving through Kearney, wondering how this small town in Hudson County became this cradle of soccer. There were 3 players on the 1994 U.S. national team, the last time the U.S. hosted the World Cup, who came from Kearney, who all played together, and I just always found that fascinating. And so we're increasing our coverage of soccer and culture and community leading up to the World Cup, and I had to do this story on Kearney. And it turns out I just knew a fraction of the history. I talked to a lot of Kearney soccer lifers, historians, and it was so amazing to learn about that rich history dating back to the 1870s of Scottish immigrants embracing this new sport of soccer, continued throughout the 20th century into the 21st century. Now it's mostly Hispanic immigrants and first-generation people living in Kearney and still keeping that tradition alive. And so I love doing that story. I was really excited about that.
For you New Yorkers who only know Kearney because you drive by near, 15W or something on the Turnpike, and you think it's pronounced Kearney. Yeah, it's that place, Kearny, but it's Kearney. It's always been Kearney. I don't know. Can the people from Kearney today afford those tickets to even go see the games? So we have 20 seconds.
Can anyone afford those tickets? No. So hopefully we'll at least have some fan fests and stuff in New Jersey, which they're planning. But yeah, maybe they can unlock some cheaper tickets for Soccer Town, USA, people in Kearney, New Jersey.
Well, I see they just lowered that headline-making round-trip ticket price from Penn Station to MetLife for some of those matches. Instead of $150 round-trip just to take NJ Transit there and back, they've reduced it down to $105. Okay, a little different than the usual $12 or whatever it is. So there we leave it for today with David Brand. David, thanks for some time this morning.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.